go. And again, welcome everyone. My name is Dawn Heglin. I'm the Executive Director of the Upper Minnesota Valley Regional Development Commission. Our office serves 5 counties in western Minnesota, and we help cities and counties and townships and schools do a wide variety of things. And in the last number of years, housing continues to be a top issue throughout our region. And so what I did today was ask some experts to join us, talk about some things that they're doing or can help with related to housing. And really today is about learning and hopefully planting some seeds for you on tools you might be able to implement in your community. So as part of our agenda today, first, we're going to hear from Lisa Graffentine. She's worked in the housing field for a long time and is doing some housing consulting with a number of communities, including some in our region. Lisa, I'll have you introduce yourself in just a minute, but then we're also joined by Leanna Larson from the Swift County HRA and RDA. And again, she's going to talk about what they're working on in Swift County. Then Elizabeth Glidden's with us today from Minnesota Housing Partnership. She's going to share some of the information she has available for communities who are looking at setting up some of these tools. And kind of wrapping up today, Chad Adams from the Southwest Minnesota Housing Partnership. And again, an organization that serves many communities working on housing related issues. And he's going to talk about some models they're using in communities across Southwest Minnesota. And I think all of these examples are great for you to go back to your committees, to your boards, to your councils, have some conversation about it and see if there's something here that might make sense for your community. So I am also joined by 3 members of my team, Christy, Bernie, and Kevin. They're going to help monitor the chat today. I would encourage you to use the chat if you have questions. You'll be able to ask questions. You can take yourself off mute at the end of each presentation and ask questions to the presenters, and we'll have time at the end of today's discussion as well. Without further ado, I will have our guest presenters just introduce yourself briefly, all 4 of you, and then we'll turn it over to Lisa to kick us off.
That's good. Thanks, Dawn. I'm Lisa Graffentine. I'm the Director of Housing and Economic Development with Development Services. We provide housing and economic development consulting, and I'm currently working with the Big Stone Area Growth, Ortonville EDA, and also the Meeker County EDA as part of my work.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leanna Larson. I am the director for the Swift County HRA and the RDA, and I'll be talking today about the Swift County Local Housing Trust Fund.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Glidden. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Minnesota Housing Partnership. We are a 30-plus year nonprofit that works in the areas of policy and research, and also providing direct services like capacity building to rural communities and Native nations. And I'll be talking about local housing trust funds and our technical assistance programs for communities.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. This is Chad Adams, Chief Executive Officer for the Southwest Minnesota Housing Partnership. We're a nonprofit community development corporation providing housing community development services in 30 counties in Southwest and South Central Minnesota. And I'll be talking about our community land trust today.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for that. Lisa, should I bring up your presentation?
Sounds good. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As I mentioned, I do some economic development and housing consulting work. And prior to joining Development Services, I worked for the partnership for a number of years. So housing is actually some of my favorite aspect of the economic development field. And I'm going to spend my time today really talking about the housing aid and some thoughts really kind of from that 10,000 foot level. And then I think Leanna, Chad, and Elizabeth are really going to dive into some of the specifics on housing trust funds and then also community land trusts. So I just want to start out by talking about something that is one of the newest tools kind of in our toolbox for communities, and that is county housing aid. Personally, I'm really excited about these funds. And even though I think, when we look at the dollar amounts, they're maybe not enough to tackle all of our needs and big projects within our community, they're really a great source to kind of help you do some gap financing on projects. And I think for a lot of time as I visit with small communities to talk about their housing needs and trying to access Minnesota housing resources, they really feel that it's hard for them to compete on a statewide level for some of those dollars. So this really puts some of the resources in the control of the counties and our local communities to be able to address housing needs, especially if you want to just build one single family home or build a duplex project. So again, some exciting aspects there. So basically with the county housing aid, every county received an allocation of funds starting in 2023, as well as all cities over 10,000. So we don't have any cities within our upper Minnesota Valley region that would have received a direct allocation. We've got some time to spend the resources. So basically counties have until I think December 31st of the fourth year after the aid was received. So there's time to spend it, but now is a great time to really start planning and thinking about how you as counties want to potentially use this aid within your community. And just to kind of give you an example for those of you maybe that aren't as familiar with the county housing aid. So in Big Stone County, for example, we received just over 83,000 in 2023, and we'll also receive that in 2024. And in Meeker County, who I also work with, they were right around that $100,000 mark. So I think for most of the counties within the upper Minnesota Valley region, we're kind of in that range of 83,000 to kind of 91,000 for kind of what we're going to get per year. And that's going to be for the 2-year. And then our understanding is in year 3, that's going to be cut down to approximately half of those amounts. So let's maybe start by talking about what is potentially eligible. And so what this slide does is, and again, I don't really follow the slide rules here in terms of text, but there's a lot of information that comes with this aid. And so I thought it'd just be best to kind of have the information there and we could talk through some of it. The list is actually pretty large in terms of what you can do with the funds. Emergency rental assistance for households under 80% area median income. And one of the things you're going to find is that there's a lot of different references to income limits and different income limits depending on the type of activities that are being done. So just kind of something to keep in mind as you look to develop programs is to making sure you're aware of what those income limits are for your specific county as you look to implement these dollars. Another area is that you can provide financial support to nonprofit housing organizations as well. So this might be nonprofit groups like the Housing Partnership. It might be your local housing authority. So, partnering with those organizations as well. I think some of the conversations that we've had at the county level is that, like, we, for instance, have partnered with our housing authority on using some of these dollars, but we put in place very specific parameters and expectations because in the end, your county is going to have to be the one reporting back to Minnesota Housing saying what you use the funds for. So just make sure that, if you do set up any kind of collaborations or partnerships to use it to support another entity, that you have some, again, parameters around that to ensure that they're meeting the guidelines of what needs to be accomplished and you're going to be able to report what you got accomplished with those dollars. I think the next one is an area that's kind of exciting, I think, for some of our counties, because we often hear that, there's really not a lot of market rate choices available in terms of rentals. So when people first move into the community, whether they're a new teacher, a local engineer, someone, CNA working at the hospital or a nurse, sometimes there's not any market rate. There may be above income limits that are there for other properties, and there's not a lot of market rate available. So you're going to find this language within the aid that really, again, it's a super long explanation, but the basics of it is that if you can get a project that qualifies for the workforce housing program that Minnesota Housing has, you can use these funds for that. Just keep in mind, if you go down this path, there are specific things that you have to document. So in order to qualify for the workforce housing program, there's a list of eligible communities. You have to have vacancy rates under certain levels. You have to have employer participation, but letters of support from employers. So again, there's a way to be able to do some market rate development to meet your workforce needs. Just make sure you get those pieces documented within your files. And then there's kind of this large overarching category 2 that really talks about, the fact that you can do construction, acquisition, rehab, demolition, construction financing, permanent financing, interest rate reductions, gap financing, so all sorts of activities. So again, as I mentioned, there's a lot of eligible things that you can do with these funds. When you're doing these components, you do need to make sure that you meet the income requirements, and those are different based on whether your project is a home ownership project or a rental development. And you can see there that's 115% or 80% based on the activity you do of either the greater of state or area median income. So a lot of activities there. And then two, again, the last category, that housing developed or rehabbed with funds under the program must be affordable to the local workforce. So just kind of making sure that you're understanding, what the jobs in your community are paying and align your efforts to that. They do ask that projects are prioritized for affordable housing development as well. And again, you can see the income limits that they want there. So make sure if you're creating any kind of guidelines that you address some of these priority areas. And they also kind of look at the fact that you should try to give priority to projects that reduce disparities in home ownership, reduce kind of that housing cost burden, instability or homelessness, improve the habitability of homes, create more accessible homes, and then also that kind of energy or green aspect of it as well. And then it defines for you what gap financing is. So if you ever kind of have a question about what gap financing is, it talks about the fact that that's either the difference between the cost of the property and either the market value upon sale. So let's just say that you build a property, excuse me, but the market value upon sale is less than that. You can use the gap financing to fill that difference. Or gap financing can be on the buyer side in the fact that it's based on what they can afford versus what the cost of the home is. So it can both be that what's called a value gap or an affordability gap when it comes to the home buyer. And I think something really important to keep in mind, because I know a lot of our communities, we're always looking for money to address demolition needs within our community, because we do maybe have a lot of different dilapidated properties in our community. You can do demolition with this, but just keep in mind that you then have to use the cleared land for the construction of housing to be owned or rented by persons who meet the income limits that are established through the program. So it is not a program that's designed to do demolition and then just to leave the sites bare with no use. It's a great opportunity though, if you, for instance, are going to maybe collaborate to do a spec home or to do some maybe like an affordable duplex, and you want to be able to clear that site beforehand, you would be able to do that with the funds. And then just kind of lastly, depending on, the size of your project, the state language does include some information too, that if your project is either new construction or the substantial rehab of a building containing more than 4 units, you do have to look at some accessibility components as part of that. And so looking at, again, you have to do the math based on the size of the project. So if it's a really small project, like 6 units, you would go with the at least one category. But if it's something larger, like you're doing a 50-unit development, then you've got to have 3, because that would be 2.5 units if you look at the 5%. And then also, so there's the accessibility piece that's defined within here, but then there's also sensory accessible as well that's defined. So just keep that in mind if you're looking to do anything that falls into that category of new construction or more than 4 units. And again, it clarifies too that these guidelines don't relieve a project funded by this aid program from meeting other applicable accessibility requirements. So if you're layering in other resources that have additional accessibility requirements, you can't waive those other requirements as part of it. So that's a little bit about the county housing aid. The other thing I just kind of wanted to touch on related to this is that, as I mentioned, if you're a city over 10,000, they also receive direct aid. But for those of us that are not within that category, there is going to be $4.5 million that is set aside for cities under 10,000. So let's just say that you're a community and maybe you've got an idea for a project and that maybe doesn't align with what how the county wants to use their aid, or maybe again, there's just too many projects when they're within your county based on the total aid available. You as a city will be able to competitively apply for funding. We don't know a lot yet in terms of or I haven't about timelines, maybe Chad or some of them have heard a little bit more like when this will be released, but they just have some very basic information out right now regarding this in terms of, we do know that it's going to be a minimum award of $25,000. And we also know that the Minnesota Housing has created a web page that really highlights this program, the aid, and some other resources as well. So there's the kind of that website information. And I think then the next slide, I just kind of included a screenshot. Oh, no, that's right. I wanted to cover this first. So before I kind of show you the screenshot of the website, I think the other thing that's on this page that is something that may be of interest to communities within the region is going to be the Greater Minnesota Housing Infrastructure Grants. And this is an allocation of $8 million in one-time funding. $8 million is not going to go far as you start to, think about the costs of infrastructure, but it's there to support communities in developing new workforce housing. And again, there's really kind of a wide list, and that the grant funds can be used to help develop infrastructure for single family, multifamily, owner rental, and it can cover up to 50% of the public infrastructure costs. I mean, I remember working in some communities and we were creating lots and putting in infrastructure for $10,000, $20,000 a lot. And I'm seeing estimates anywhere from $50,000 to $80,000 per lot now for infrastructure, depending on what it takes to get those infrastructure extended to the new land. So again, that can include your sewer, water, utility, street, various types of aspects of your public infrastructure. And then they have provided some information regarding what the limits will be. And so grants are going to be limited to $30,000 per lot for kind of that 1 to 4 unit category, $180,000 per lot for multifamily housing of 5 or more. And then you can't have more than $500,000 to cities over a 2-year period. And then you have to have a non-state match as part of it. So that's, again, something to kind of to keep in mind. I know a lot of communities have been talking about infrastructure extensions to add new single family or multifamily housing, and some of them have put that on hold based on the cost of that infrastructure. So kind of keep your eye out for this. And then the next slide is a screenshot that really just shows this space where Minnesota Housing has created a page to kind of talk about these various programs. So the information on it is pretty limited right now, but eventually you're going to be able to go to this page and you're going to get more information on housing trust funds, the infrastructure grants, the housing aid, all of that will be posted there. So again, and Leanna's going to touch on that housing trust fund information later, so she'll dive into that. So I think now the question kind of always becomes for communities, we have this aid, what do we do with it? And how do we kind of proceed forward? And so again, I find that this is a really unique opportunity to tailor, these resources for projects that meet your county needs. And so within the guidelines, of course, you can't do maybe anything that you want to do, but those guidelines provide a lot of different opportunities for you to be able to do. And so I think one of the key questions that, I've asked myself and kind of working with the counties is that, what are our housing needs? And so in Meeker County, for instance, we were very fortunate. It was just last year, we did an updated housing study. It identified for us, we need over 500 new housing units, pretty much of all types, from single family, multifamily, senior housing. And so really then as a county, we talked about the fact that because our needs are maybe not limited to one type of housing or one sector of housing, we really want to keep our guidelines and process really open for any developments that are going to help us meet our needs and also fall within the guidelines. And so that study was really kind of important and helpful for us to kind of guide some of our decision making and kind of knowing what our needs kind of were within the county. And so another question too that often comes up, and we've talked about in some of the counties I've worked with is where do our funding gaps exist? And so, and here's just an example, and we haven't made any for sure decisions on it, but in Big Stone County, a year ago, we started doing some planning and really wanted to address housing rehab needs within small communities, maybe that struggle to access, the small cities program just because of the level of work that's involved with it. But also we had a discussion around rural rehab. And so, and the small cities program is not a good fit for that. They don't allow us to, select 4 or 5 townships from some of our counties and be able to put together rehab programs. And so we kind of looked at, where are some of those gaps that current programs are not addressing the housing needs, that we, in a sense, could then create our own program to fill some of those gaps using some of these resources. And so that's just kind of one example, as to how we can maybe help parts of our county that can't get assistance from other programs that are out there. And then really this other question we asked ourselves too is, how can we use these funds to leverage other resources? And also, are we leveraging all the other funds before we use our aid? We don't want to, it might be really easy to say, housing rehab, it'd be super easy to create a program and use this aid to address housing rehab. But in the end, like, we know that the small cities is a resource that's used in multiple communities and can bring hundreds of thousands of dollars into our communities to address the rehab needs. And so we want to ensure that we're accessing the POP funding, which is public housing rehab dollars. We're accessing small cities, the workforce grant. And this is really filling, a void that those programs cannot fill. So that's kind of how we're looking at it too, is, we don't want to just duplicate what other programs can do simply because it's the easy route to take. So trying to, again, figure out where we can go that route. In terms of paths, there's a lot of different paths that you can take as a county. Leanna and Elizabeth are going to touch on the housing trust funds, and that's a great way. Some of the positive aspects are that it's a really good way to dedicate the funds, and it also creates the ability to leverage other funds as well as part of that. You can also, if you don't feel like you want to go down the path of a housing trust fund, you can go down the path of creating maybe your own county application process. And that's where you can establish your own guidelines, again, following the state guidelines, of course, and then create an application process to allow requests to come to you. So maybe, you don't even know what developments are out there that potentially may have gap financing needs. Maybe that, in Meeker County, I've got actually like 3 or 4 developments happening. So this will be a way to kind of, again, get the information out to all of them, and they can kind of apply for the dollars to us. And then kind of, again, there can be this, another path you can take is that you identify local projects. And so you maybe already have a developer that is working in your community. They've got a site identified. They've created a concept. And they're just now kind of at that point of struggling to figure out how to fill the financing gaps that they have. And so this can be a great way that you identify that this could be a great partnership and project, and try to figure out kind of what gaps they have, and is this a good fit to be able to make some of those projects happen. And then, of course, like, you can do a combination of these, as well, as part of your process, or you maybe have different ideas altogether as to how you kind of want to set it up. So there's really, there's no set way that you have to, devise a certain process or structure to be able to use. That's kind of within your control to figure out what's the best fit for you. And then kind of last, I just want to highlight, a couple of the ideas that we've been kind of talking about in Big Stone County and Meeker County based on our preliminary discussion and how we've made some of those decisions. So in Big Stone County, what we did is that we did dedicate some of the funding there to our local housing authority, which then provided them the opportunity to leverage some additional funds. So in conjunction with this, we're also working with them on a POP application, which is a high priority. So they right now have a project that it's a major plumbing project within the building, basically complete, renovation of the plumbing system. That's an old cast iron system. It's a major project, and they never get enough HUD funds to be able to address it. And so what we've decided to do is that we are not going to make any further decisions on our housing aid until we can figure out that they're going to be able to leverage enough other funds to be able to do that project. And so we're working with them to try to use POP funding. We're going to leverage that with some small cities dollars. So in the end, we might not have to use any of our aid for that project, but we just kind of want to, again, this is a really important project. And then, as a good example for us, just taking a small amount of our housing aid and working with our housing authority, we're hoping to bring in over $700,000 of other resources from POP and small cities to be able to do this project. So again, it's kind of back to that point of how can we maybe use some of this aid to leverage a lot more dollars within our county. to be able to do projects. And then in Meeker County, what we decided to do is that we are creating a set of guidelines and an application process. Currently, our EDA within Meeker County, we were fortunate that we had owned some housing units, sold them, and that generated some resources for us. And so we decided to set up a housing program. So I already kind of had a process in place where if developers had some gap financing needs, they could come to our EDA, and we kept it pretty flexible that we are working on both single family projects, multifamily. We provide some funds as construction, permanent financing. So really trying to be flexible to what the developers need. So we had already set up that resource within our EDA. And so some of the conversation, and we had looked at, do we do a housing trust fund as part of this? And at the current time, we decided not to do a trust fund, simply because, like my board, for instance, was a little bit concerned that, once we did that, we would dedicate the funds. I don't mind kind of that aspect of dedicating the funds. I think then that it's there, but we also have a lot of other needs around like childcare and workforce development. So they like to be flexible and kind of have that flexibility piece versus dedicating it. On the negative side, though, by us not doing a housing trust fund, we do leave some potential dollars on the table. And so I'm sure Elizabeth and Leanna will talk about the state, the state funds, for housing trust funds. So that is something that, we may have the benefit that we can be more flexible, but we're potentially leaving some dollars on the table by not creating that trust fund. But what the county decided in Meeker County is that because the EDA, we already had a process for reviewing kind of gap financing needs within our county, that they would let us take the lead in creating the guidelines and the application process for the aid. And then it will still have, though, county oversight. So ultimately, the EDA will take we'll do all promotion of the dollars we have available. We'll take all applications. We'll do the underwriting. We'll kind of make recommendations in terms of, if a developer, say, needs $200,000, we might say, all right, we're going to use 150 out of the EDA funds and then 50 out of the county housing aid. And then we provide as a recommendation to the county board. So they still have the ultimate say in what we do, but we're just kind of doing all of the application processing, making sure the project meets the eligibility criteria, and then doing the underwriting to ensure that the need is there for both the EDA dollars or county housing aid as well. And then also the county decided, so similar to Big Stone, we also, our HRA was doing some renovation projects where they were looking to access some small cities dollars and needed some leverage dollars to be able to do that. So for a small, using a small portion of this for rehab to serve some of our lowest income households, we were able to leverage some additional dollars through small cities as part of that. So again, that's kind of what we're looking at doing there. And I think the only other thing I'll just kind of add at the end is that, with the aid, I can't say it enough that I'm really excited about what this brings to our local areas, that, again, if we struggle to be competitive for some of the state resources, it's a great opportunity for us. And in sitting in on some of the webinars that were hosted by the League of Minnesota Cities and Association of Minnesota Counties, the legislators, there was a clear message that I heard, and that is, we want these funds to get out there and be deployed, and we want to show the need, because if this is something that we really need in our communities, we should get it into projects. And, maybe there would be a potential that we can continue to advocate for more of these dollars. And how great would it be for our communities to, again, have our own locally controlled, driven, meeting our need type of resources to be able to address the housing. So again, even if you maybe haven't made full decisions, which my counties haven't either, we're still kind of in that planning phase, but we are actively having the discussions regarding how we move it forward and ensuring that we get the funds used and put into projects and can really show the state that this is something that is really needed within our small rural communities. So with that, that's all I've got.
Thanks, Lisa. That was a great introduction and kind of overview at, all of kind of the housing issues and how do we layer some of these ideas and resources together to really do good in our communities. So we certainly can be open to ask any questions. Anybody have any questions they'd like to ask at this time from Lisa? can raise your hand, or you can just put it in the chat, or just take yourself off of mic. Okay, well, we will then maybe move right into Leanna, and you can talk about, again, some more examples of what's happening locally related to housing. Leanna, take it over.
All right, thank you. So I'll talk a little bit about Swift County and oh, excuse me, our local housing trust fund. So I'll kind of share some background. I'll be open with you that I was not here when these were first started, so I'm kind of relying on some of the history that I've learned, but kind of give you an overview of how it started and where we're at with our trust fund. So in 2019, a leadership group from Swift County attended the National Association of Counties conference, and they participated in the Rural Impact County Challenge. So they worked together to try to understand the link between housing, health, and equity. And they kind of set up this goal to establish a local housing trust fund. They wanted to find something that had those dedicated funds that could be used for housing preservation and financing affordable housing. Swift County, I think one of our strong points is that we've always had a very strong dedication to rehab programs. We've worked for many years with a variety of different programs through Minnesota Housing, Small Cities, Federal Home Loan Bank, and the Housing Assistance Council to offer rehab programs throughout the county. I think establishing the local housing trust fund was just kind of viewed as another tool for, the county to be able to utilize to reach people. One of the big benefits, I think, of the trust fund is that there are no target areas. And so we're going to be able to serve some of those folks who previously were not able to get access to those funds. Local housing trust funds can be established by elected government bodies at the city, county, or state level. The HRA and the RDA directors at the time, it used to be two separate entities, they worked together to create the ordinance that was eventually passed adopted by the Swift County Commissioners in July of 2020. At that time, they appointed the HRA to administer the fund. And the priorities that they initially identified were to build single family and multifamily new construction, as well as owner occupied and rental rehab. The first project that we identified was the rehabilitation of Graymar Court, a rural development 515 property that's located in Kirkoven, Minnesota. The project was started in 2019, and no one ever would have predicted that it would take us 4 years to be able to purchase the building. But I can say that we have officially purchased the building as of December, and we'll be starting construction here soon. So that was truly the first project that they plan to use, and it is the only project so far that we have used our trust fund for. It's taken a lot longer to be able to get to that point. We recently had a housing study completed in Swift County, and so we have taken those results and we're now working on updating our guidelines and kind of getting our housing trust fund program fully functional and available to the community. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But when the fund was originally established, the board committed to approving $50,000 worth of levy funds each year for the fund. The HRA also has an investment in Benson Corn Pool, and any kind of distributions that we receive are deposited into the local housing trust fund as well. So we have those two dedicated reoccurring funds that are going into this. Recently, Lisa talked about the county housing aid, and our board passed an agreement to dedicate our county housing aid to the local housing trust fund. I think there's maybe some unsurety of how this will all play out, but initially the message was that if these funds were transferred into a local housing trust fund, they were considered spent. Now I'm kind of hearing some rumblings that the reporting may look a little different, but we'll see how it all shakes out. So I think we're planning to utilize the funds, but making sure that we're following both sets of guidelines in there. So so that's another way that we've added some funding to ours. The other piece that I wanted to touch on is that last year the legislature allocated $4.8 million for a one-to-one match of any public revenue from any other source other than state and federal government, up to $150,000. They also have a 50% match for any revenue that's between 150 to 300,000. The RFP has not been released for this yet, and I haven't heard when that's coming, but I think with all of the new things that were passed in legislature last year, Minnesota Housing is kind of scrambling to pull everything together and hire staff and get things out. So so one of the things that Swift County did in anticipation of this matching grant was that we levied extra money so that we would be eligible for the full match. So in 2024, we've levied $150,000 instead of the $50,000 that we normally do. So that's kind of how we fund our program. Just to touch on a few of the requirements for local housing trust funds. Annual reporting is required to the board that created the trust fund. Local housing trust funds are allowed to, or the administrators are allowed to charge up to 10% of the funds for administrative fees. Funds can be used for grants and loans for development, rehabilitation, or financing of housing. It can be used as a match for other funds, kind of as Lisa talked about. You can use it to provide down payment assistance, rental assistance, homebuyer counseling services. There's a wide range of things that you can use the trust fund for. The fund can be utilized for very low, low, and moderate incomes, with gross incomes at 115% of AMI. And I think that's one nice thing. The majority of the programs that we've worked with have kind of capped the AMI at 80%. And so I think this allows us to serve a population that hasn't been able to access any funding, but probably still needs that support. So I think that's an important piece of it. As far as utilizing the fund, we are again in the process of kind of developing our application. Our plan is that once we receive those applications, the HRA staff will approve at least any rental or owner-occupied rehab projects based on the criteria. If they're eligible for the program, we're going to have the authority to approve those applications so that we can keep projects moving. Any new developments would require approval from the HRA board. Funds are available on a first come, first serve basis. We had talked at our HRA board meeting about, defining our priorities and, putting a percentage. But the board felt that they wanted to just be really flexible with things and, kind of see, we don't know, since we've never used this, what the demand will be. So we decided to just kind of keep it on a first come, first serve basis. As part of our housing study, we utilize those recommendations also then to kind of define our priorities, and that's kind of where we're coming up with our guidelines. So our recommendations were to construct 60 to 70 single family homes, 45 to 50 market rate multifamily homes by 2028, as well as continuing rehab programs for owner occupied and rental. So those are kind of the target areas that we have in our guidelines. So for owner occupied rehab projects, households are eligible for up to $25,000 as a 20-year deferred forgivable loan at 0% interest. And the homeowner contribution is determined by their AMI. So the higher the AMI, the higher the contribution they'll have. For our rental rehab projects, those can qualify for $12,500 up to $20,000 per unit, depending on affordability. So again, the more units that are reserved for lower income folks, the more funding the project is eligible for. Again, this is a 20-year loan term with a deferred repayment. If the affordability conditions are met throughout the term, the lump sum repayment will be reduced by 50%. So that's hopefully a good incentive to keep affordability measures in place. And then finally, our new development loans. Again, we'll have a 20-year term, 0% interest, but there is no forgivable portion in this loan. But we do prioritize developments that have affordability built in. When we were looking at making the guidelines, we wanted to make it attractive and useful for the community, but we didn't want it to be the go-to program. So that's why we have longer terms. So it won't be attractive to everyone. You know, I think our elderly folks probably won't want to use this because then it'll end up getting paid back in the end. But I think there are other opportunities for some of them as well. So when I was drafting the guidelines too, I talked with a lot of other counties and cities and kind of worked with them on, you know, what's working for you? What have you guys been doing? I think that was a big help for me. Also utilizing Minnesota Housing Partnerships handbook. That gives a lot of good information on just kind of the background of what a housing trust fund is and what some of the terminology means. And again, I guess just to kind of wrap things up, I think for us, it's really, I think, an important fund to be able to offer to the community. I think that it's nice that we have that flexibility and we can address the changing needs over time. So, you know, if we're seeing that, you know, we really need to switch lanes and go to something else, we can adjust our guidelines and do it that way. So it really gives us that local control on spending. We're hoping to have our guidelines approved by the board by spring and have everything kind of available at that time. So once that is, you can check out our website and it'll be available there. So that's all I've got.
Great. Thanks, Leanna. And again, that's a great example of, you know, again, how one county, you know, it was looking at their housing needs very specifically with, you know, a property that was a priority for you to do some rehab and acquisition for, and then thinking about how these dollars can be spread out and really address other priorities that were identified in your housing study. So nice work. Questions for Leanna?
I had one, Leanna. This is John from Appleton. We're working on moving homes into our community so that we fill up some of our infill lots. Would moving a house, the expenses for that qualify?
For the local housing trust fund, I think so. I think that we could make something work with that as far as development goes. You know, I think that is the nice part about the way that we're writing at least the development piece, is that we are leaving it kind of broad so that there is some board discretion in how we approve or, you know, review those things. So
great.
Yeah,
so good, because we're finding that the cost per square foot building is so expensive. I can move a house in for about $120 a square foot versus building for $200 to $250. So, okay.
Yeah, great.
Other questions? Elizabeth, I see you have your hand raised.
Well, didn't want to jump ahead of everyone. I just maybe a little comment. MHP actually has been working with Swift County on the Graymar Court project for a long time. And I was just going to say, usually when I talk about local housing trust funds, I always talk about Swift County. So I just really wanted to kind of promote what you have done. And my understanding is, you know, it was sort of a launching of this initiative, not that you weren't thinking of it before, to preserve this property that was perceived as very important to the county as a whole and, you know, to the community. And also, I think it's kind of that you have unique funding sources that you were able to identify to put into the local housing trust fund. I share that story all the time because I think local government has sometimes a little bit more discretion and just opportunities than sometimes we perceive. And I feel like Swift County really showcased that.
Well, thanks. That's nice to hear. And yes, we've worked with Jill, and actually Lisa has been part of that project as well. So, and I don't think we would have made it through this project if it weren't for them. So definitely appreciate the help there.
Great. Thanks for those comments. Chad, do you have a comment?
Just clarifying question. So Leanna, you mentioned that market rate rental housing is a need in the county. I didn't quite catch if the housing trust fund will also be used as some type of a leverage or a potential funding source for market rate housing, and can it be?
It could be, as long as there were at least some units that were reserved for affordability. But
Got it.
again, you know, that's up to that 115. So it's a little less restrictive than some other projects or programs, I mean.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Questions? Oh, great. Yes, and oops, there we go. And Elizabeth just posted into the chat that the enabling statute for local housing trust funds does not have income restrictions. So again, good feedback. And if there's no other questions, actually, we're going to turn it over to Elizabeth, and you're going to talk a little bit about how the partnership can help and in resources that we've already heard about today. So Elizabeth.
Okay, right. And I'll do my best to kind of skip over what others have mentioned. First, the first challenge is sharing my screen and making sure I can do that. So hang on. Okay. Does that share look right?
It does.
All right, perfect. Okay, so just again, my name is Elizabeth Glidden. I'm with the Minnesota Housing Partnership. Hang on, let me make sure my cursor is allowing me to move forward. And again, we are a 30+ year nonprofit that works in these areas. We do original research. A lot of people know us from our State of the State of Housing. We do county profiles on housing. We do legislative district profiles on housing, and we're about to release our 2023 State of the State's Housing publication. We work in the area of public policy. Most of that is at the state level. We do some federal work too. And then the work we did with Swift County and other communities around Minnesota is through our community development department, which is also the department that offers the technical assistance we're going to be talking about. Our services are focused on serving rural communities and Native nations. This is work that is rooted in Minnesota. So this is kind of our Minnesota map of some service territories, but we also do this community development work, providing technical assistance around the country. So just to kind of reiterate, we've talked about local housing trust funds, what they are, but I do find that sometimes there is a little bit of confusion on who can adopt a local housing trust fund. And if you want one that is sort of recognized by some of these state programs, it is something that needs to be adopted by your local elected body. So the HRA, the EDA is not the body to adopt it. The HRA or the EDA can be the body to administer it, and that in fact is very common. And again, just at the broadest level, that this is a fund that is dedicated to addressing housing needs. So in 2017, Minnesota and MHP was involved in advocating for this, passed what you might call like enabling legislation. That is a little bit maybe of a misnomer though, because cities and counties were fully able to enact a local housing trust fund before there was enabling legislation. This is something that has commonly happened in other states, however, sometimes to give clarity to what cities and counties can do, and also to set up a mechanism by which you might be able to attach a funding opportunity, which now has happened in the state of Minnesota because we have a local housing trust fund match fund. And as you know, kind of reflected in the chat, this enabling statute is really very broad in the uses that it identifies and defines that can be utilized within a local housing trust fund. So taking a read as a short statute is not a bad thing to do, just to kind of refresh yourself on what's in there. I wanted to talk just a little bit about the benefits of a local housing trust fund, just at a pretty high level. Because a local housing trust fund is just one tool like other tools, and it's a decision to make, is this the right thing to invest your time in to help advance your housing needs? So again, you're looking for what is going to be helpful to you as a local community in advancing your housing needs. And these are some of the high level benefits that we have been identifying. One is this idea that you are dedicating sources of revenue to housing in your local housing trust fund, because once you put it in your local housing trust fund, it is there to address housing needs. How you do that can happen in a lot of different ways. And as an example, this sometimes is a difference between one-time funds or funds that often kind of, you know, like a levy, like the HRA levy, that might be considered a fund where yes, the elected body kind of reconsiders it each year, but once it's sort of set at a certain level, you're probably continuing that on at that level, or you hope so. And that can be very helpful in giving sort of a predictability to both your community, to local government staff, and to developers or others that you are trying to attract to help you achieve your housing goals, in trying to, why would you set this up to help give that, set the stage with that predictability. I think it was Lisa that talked a little bit about leverage, and I think this is just a really important point, and leverage can be talked about in multiple different ways. One of the ways that sometimes we talk about leverage is just in terms of kind of economic value of what you're doing with some public resources. And so this is why we see, often the questions, what is the leverage you're going to receive out of the private market? This is a national figure that on average for every $1, you might leverage 6 in additional public and private funds. But we have found that this is pretty similar to what you'll see with maybe slight variation locally as well. The other very important point is how a local housing trust fund, or resources essentially, can help in your applications for other funds to achieve your goals. So again, depending on your goal, often you might need to pull together multiple types of sources to achieve that goal. And if that's the case, we are in just frankly a fairly competitive environment right now with applications for housing funds because of the great need within our state and because of how some programs are funded. And just I heard one time a Minnesota housing staff member say having that local resource offered is just like gold as part of your application process. It really is impactful because it shows commitment. It's a way to show commitment. Flexibility is one of these kind of hallmark benefits of a local housing trust fund, and that's kind of similar also to how Lisa talked about the statewide housing aid program. So with a local housing trust fund, again, you have that flexibility to make decisions that design a program or tweak a program to really fit your local needs. That you might look at how you, this last point, can fill gaps not served by other programs. Sometimes that happens, that there is a state program or other program, but it doesn't fully address your need. This could be used to kind of leverage up, like with the gap financing or other ways. Maybe you want to add on to a program like a rehab program and offer a bigger benefit because that is what is needed to make that program work in your community. And so this is one of those I think, kind of hallmark reasons that many communities look at a local housing trust fund to give themselves that decision-making and flexibility. And I think we've sort of talked about this already, but again, just having the local housing trust fund is a way that you are making a statement. You are making a statement that, again, is heard by others on how housing fits within the priorities of your community. And that can be important in and of itself. Red Wing, Minnesota, this was kind of one of the very early adopters of a local housing trust fund. Randall Hemmerlin was the now retired executive director of the Red Wing HRA. And he really kind of beat the drum on this, local control is something that is benefited by a local housing trust fund. And again, that you're able to work on programs that otherwise might not be funded. One of the cities that I have done a little bit of work with is the city of Alexandria. They really wanted a program for doing rehab on small rentals like, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. And they were having trouble finding what would be those sources to kind of really leverage that program. And Local Housing Trust Fund was the way that they launched that initiative that they felt was important to their community. Local housing trust funds are very common across the United States. I feel like right now we're really seeing this increase in Minnesota of local housing trust funds, a lot because of how the state funds are kind of helping communities see there could be a benefit to kind of leveraging those resources across local and state, but very commonly utilized across the country. Minnesota Housing Partnership has invested quite a bit of resources in supporting communities in establishing local housing trust funds. One of those resources is this manual that we created a few years ago. It is specific to the state of Minnesota. It has a lot of references to Minnesota type of resources and processes, and it is a good, I think, reference source. These are some of the things that you might see referenced in that manual, kind of helping you go through both how you might go through the process of thinking through establishing a local housing trust fund, such as identifying your funding sources, to thinking about more of your implementation concerns once you have established the fund and then identified what would be the program or programs you want to be operated from the fund. This is actually, like, there are so many cities and counties that are considering local housing trust funds right now that this isn't definitely an outdated slide. I feel like every time I turn around, there's a different city that is raising questions or a different county that is raising questions about working to adopt a local housing trust fund. So over in that green column, those are just sort of a quick hit list of just a few of the communities that either have just established or are on the verge of establishing a local housing trust fund, and it is not comprehensive. So in the past years, MHP has produced a couple of different short publications that have shared stories of what different cities and counties are doing with their local housing trust funds, and kind of a graph of the cities and counties that have local housing trust funds. I can put that in the chat for you guys after I speak. Some of those, I do think they're helpful because they kind of bring out the stories a little bit. But also it helps you know what are the peer communities you might think of reaching out to if you want to have more of that peer community type conversation. And of course, SWIFT. One of the things that we've looked at is just trying to compile information on what are common ways that Minnesota jurisdictions are funding their local housing trust funds, and then how are they using their local housing trust funds? Again, just to give you a little picture of what that is like. And so these are some of the common fund sources that Minnesota cities and counties are utilizing throughout the state. I would say far and away, however, it's HRA levy and TIF pooling that are sources that are utilized. But if you have questions about any of these other sources, I'm happy to kind of give you a little bit more flavor of what that might look like or what we have heard about that's been used by other communities. Kind of again into this resource area, Leanna talked about the local housing trust fund state match, and yes, we are anxiously waiting for the application to be released. It has not yet been released. Maybe just one other thing I want to say about this match, which I will say we at MHP really fought hard. We have been working for many years to encourage the state to establish a match fund to support local communities in kind of leveraging their investments. And I think I took out these sentences, but that for your match, you have to look at new public revenue that is raised by the local community. So as an example, you cannot use the statewide housing aid as your match. So, so just to kind of say that, they're really looking at, and I think when we get that application, we will get more clarity on that item. There's not a lot of clarity other than kind of this basic language about looking for new public revenue. So I just wanted to make that point. Lisa also really covered well the statewide affordable housing aid. So just a couple things I want to point out about the statewide affordable housing aid, or the SAHA. I don't know if anybody's actually saying that other than I hear the league staff say SAHA LAHA. But one is this point about when funds are considered spent. So you have to be able to report that your funds couldn't be used on a project within, the 3-year period, or actually it's, I think, closer to 4 years. And then you put into a local housing trust fund. As Leanna mentioned, there's still questions about what that actually means. And so I wanted to just share that I have heard that Minnesota Housing has worked with the League of Minnesota Cities on an FAQ. And so we're also, that will provide a little bit more guidance on this and a few other points about the eligibility of the use of funds for the SAHA program. So I believe that should be coming probably in the next month or two, that we will be seeing those guidelines. And again, I know that the league, and I'm assuming also AMC, has informed that. I know that we have contributed questions that we have heard from local jurisdictions of just, where there's a lack of clarity. And folks, of course, want to be cautious until they get that clarity about how they're committing themselves. Continuing on this common uses. So again, the enabling statute is very broad in what you are able to use those funds for. So that was an interesting point or question someone had about, moving houses, and that's the effort that seems, to get some energy in Appleton, I think it was. But here are some of the more common programs that we are hearing about. I would say even of these, gap financing really rises to the top. And there we're kind of thinking about often a bigger project, but also could be, a single family project where you've got a gap, a funding gap. And that the local housing trust fund could be a way that you're helping to address that gap and make that project come to fruition. Home buyer assistance certainly also has been a very popular in a variety of ways, whether it's often I think I hear a lot about a variety of down payment programs, but there are other kinds of ways that we have heard about home ownership being supported through local housing trust funds. Housing stability work seemed to really gain a little bit more traction from more local communities during the pandemic, as communities were just getting a little bit more experience perhaps in how they might spend funds for housing stability. But that being said, there have been Goodhue, I think, is an example of a county that well before the pandemic always had funds sort of set aside for flexible use for housing stability services, and that they would be able to use in kind of a variety of ways. So I think from that, I was just going to maybe highlight a couple of examples before we close it out for some questions. Of just communities where we have a little bit of knowledge of what they've done. Crow Wing County is one that has now had a local housing trust fund for a number of years. As is extremely common, they identified the HRA, and so Brainerd kind of is like the same entity that is also the Crow Wing County HRA and is the Brainerd HRA, and I think there's another smaller city that they also perform HRA duties for. So they are administering this local housing trust fund. When we first did this survey work, it was funded wholly with HRA levy dollars. They may have other sources in there by now, but they primarily used HRA levy. And they had a vision of 3 programs. I will say too, for you to know, it was important to them to use the words workforce both in their ordinance and they developed kind of a guidelines document where they identified these 3 priorities of homeownership support, rehab, and gap financing. And so again, that's sort of how you just see kind of the culture of the community kind of reflected sometimes in the narrative and the messaging around what they want to accomplish with their local housing trust fund. They had these 3 programs, but I think they were a good lesson in sometimes you really just need to figure out where you want to start and make sure you're able to get that program going. And where they decided to start was with the rehab program. They already had experience with small cities funding. And they saw doing a rehab program as an ability to address kind of a broader range of incomes and geographies that they felt were in need of rehab services that they already had experience performing. However, they had never really set up their own programs before. Primarily, their HRA has spent a lot of its effort on administering public housing programs. So this was very new to them to set up a new program. They started with the rehab, and that's where they kind of sat with that for a bit before expanding to these other programs. So that is something just to think about, is what, even with, as you refine a priority list, what is really your top priority? Where do you want to start? Because initiating these programs is not a small amount of effort. So not saying anything you all don't know, but just to kind of reiterate that. And I would also say that I really think kind of in that range of 1 to 3 programs is probably kind of gets to the max of what I've seen in local housing trust funds, and 1 to 2 programs often is where we see communities put most of their efforts. Again, more because of the effort it takes to administer different programs, and there's also a question of how much resource you have. Road Wing, I just want to mention again, I said that they were one of the earliest cities in the whole state of Minnesota that had a local housing trust fund, and I really credit Red Wing with kind of encouraging lawmakers and their own representatives at the state legislature with supporting local housing trust funds and making this something that could be understood as attractive to cities throughout the state. And they have funded their local housing trust fund with HRA levy and TIF. They really have valued that this Local Housing Trust Fund has helped them establish what I've heard of as a closer relationship between the City Council and the HRA. So at least when it was first established, I think that it was seen as a way where getting that input from the City Council was also helping to get their buy-in to some of the housing programs, and then, ensuring, everyone was on the same page, and that then they were able to really bring to fruition more projects than they had in the past. Maybe the last thing I will say is kind of like Alexandria, they also really looked to how to leverage their funds by augmenting work that they had already started on with state funding or federal funding. So small cities, rehab program dollars that they had, they looked at this as a way to expand those efforts. Also, they really looked to how they could partner with the city on efforts to revitalize their downtown area, and worked on mixed use properties. So where they were kind of had that joint goal of revitalizing a commercial property, but also kind of reestablishing often what was a living space above that commercial property. And then just a quick one here, Carver, I'm actually working with right now. They have just established a local housing trust fund. Really, the genesis for this was that they saw an opportunity to continue housing work that got augmented with the ARPA dollars. And they saw an important opportunity to essentially not leave money on the table with wanting to apply for the Local Housing Trust Fund match. So I think those were drivers beyond just the issue of hearing a lot about housing in the county. So I don't mean to not say that was a driver, but these additional things I think helped them take that step to establishing the Local Housing Trust Fund. And right now they just want to focus on one thing, which is home ownership assistance. They're looking to do that with down payment assistance programs, and they're trying to refine right now what's their most important objective with those programs. Is it first-time home buyers? Is it just general support for down payment assistance? What is it that they want to do? So they're in that refinement stage. So Minnesota Housing Partnership, I will just say we also have a broader program for technical assistance. What we call our request for technical assistance is open for applications as well. But we have a specific program for Local Housing Trust Fund technical assistance. So all of our technical assistance programs are free. We have an application process where you would submit an application, it would then be considered, and the restrictions would just be, are you eligible, and is there capacity to serve you? So for this particular program, I thought I would just highlight, what could be those, what would that look like? What are those activities? And I kind of think about it in dividing to pre-ordinance, activities and post-ordinance activities. So a lot of the activities kind of before your community may have an ordinance are more about just education and, support for the conversations. Is that what our community wants to do? So I have often been invited to variety of, EDA, HRA, you name it, board meetings, really just for the conversation and to share information as part of that process of trying to discern, what do we want to do? Is this something that we want to do? And what should we think about as we're trying to move through that process? Once an ordinance is adopted, we have assistance that we could still provide to your community. It could be about setting up some of the processes that are necessary to the local housing trust fund or that are things that you would choose are important to your community. As an example, you do not have to set up an advisory committee, but sometimes cities and counties do. I'm working with Stearns County right now, and that is something that they have said that they are think is important, an advisory committee to their local housing trust fund. We have certainly worked on how you might make decisions on the programs that you want. So that could either look like some community engagement to help inform that work, or socialize and let the community know more that you know, there is a local housing trust fund, and that government jurisdiction is here to be of assistance. Often, you know, if a county is moving forward with this, there's a bigger initiative to wanting to connect with the cities within the county, get their feedback, and then just thinking through what would be some of the steps you need to take to implement a program if you do not have an existing program, such as, you know, as a down payment assistance program new to you, then what you might want to think about as you're working on that. So this will be in the PowerPoint that I think Don will be able to share with you, but there's a link to our website where you would go right to where you could request that technical assistance and a couple of other resources. So with that, I'm going to figure out how to stop sharing my screen. There we go. All right.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Again, that was a really good kind of overview of how all of these things can kind of entangle with one another. Questions for Elizabeth about the process, the examples, the enabling legislation, their ability to provide technical assistance?
This is Chad. I have a question on the process. So with the assistance that you provide on the technical assistance, Elizabeth, what would you say is the average or typical level of engagement that's needed? Is it a 3-month commitment or 6-month commitment? Probably varies, but just kind of any context you can provide there.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I find that of the engagements we've had to date, they're kind of an either or. So either it has been something that feels like just wanted a little bit of strategy discussions and maybe some presentations, assisting the community with just an informational presentation to their county board or city council, something that is not a long engagement, or it has been something that really has been a longer engagement, like 6 months plus, could be a year. I think I will be working with Stearns County probably for more like a 9-month engagement. They have a desire to do a broader community engagement process that they think is important, and as they settle on the priorities and then set up their programs.
Yeah, good question. Any other questions from the group? Okay, well, then I'll turn it over to Chad, and we're going to hear a different tool and how that can be used to address housing in some communities. Chad.
Well, I will start to share my screen here. And I think one of the things I wanted to note with the presenters that have discussed the housing state aid, the local housing trust fund, is that they can all be used, and we talked a lot about leverage as well too, they can all be used very well with the community land trust, and I'll kind of show some examples of that. But to kind of start off and give you a little bit of background again, so we as the Southwest Minnesota Housing Partnership, of one of the many things we do, we run a community land trust. A little bit of background again about the partnership that we've already kind of discussed in terms of our mission and who we serve geographically. Here's some of the impact that we've had by leveraging a lot of those dollars that we've received throughout our 30-year history. We're getting close to $1 billion of investments and assistance, closer to 8,000 homeowners throughout our region, throughout our history. Our common customers are local governments, nonprofits, individuals, families, and especially those who are most specifically in need. Our staff and board size there, just for some reference. In addition to the Community Land Trust, just want to note again that we provide a lot of other services, whether it's community planning, technical assistance, home ownership, grant writing, development, single family, multifamily development. A specific note is we own 67 apartment complexes representing over 2,000 units throughout that 30 county jurisdiction, and actually a little bit beyond that. Also do some housing assessments and inspections and some supporting housing services. But really, again, the practical tool I want to talk about here today is the Partnership Community Land Trust and how it's under a broader umbrella of shared equity home ownership and what that really means. It's really a dramatic and strategic different approach to structuring home ownership and how we apply the various different leverage sources or subsidies that we received, and how ownership of the property per se is defined, and how the relationship between the homeowner and the sponsoring organization is managed. I'll get into some of those details here in just a little bit. More specifically, the CLT, and there's about a dozen CLTs in the state of Minnesota. We're a community-based private nonprofit organization governed by a separate board of directors than our partnership board of directors. And it's really representative of the interests of the communities or the individuals served as well. And we create affordable housing home ownership primarily by writing down the cost of home or land from the home market value purchase price. And it offers CLT homes for sale to people who cannot otherwise afford quality home ownership. So oftentimes we're kind of targeting families that are between 50 and 80% of area median income. And I'll show some practical examples of that. But it provides an alternative for a permanent affordability by controlling the resale price through a predetermined resale formula. How does it benefit home buyers? Can get a home at an affordable price. We provide pre and post purchase counseling for those who aren't familiar with home ownership. Actually has the lowest foreclosure rates of any home ownership program because there's kind of that upfront investment in sustained engagement with us as a partner. Provides stable housing cost and security from eviction. For example, we provide foreclosure homeownership services. If a homeowner is getting in a challenged situation, we'll try to work through them so they don't have to get evicted from their home. Opportunity to build equity, even though it might not be at the same traditional market rate, but a different opportunity to build equity. And an opportunity to take a leadership role in the organization by serving on the Land Trust Board of Directors. Some more information. So again, the subsidy is used to write down the purchase price of a home to a level that's affordable to the households, and that varies depending on the size of the household. For many of you who are familiar with median income and such, if it's multiple individuals in a family, it gets to be a little bit larger number in terms of what you can carry in terms of a mortgage compared to maybe just a one or two person household. Our land trust owns and holds the title of the land forever. That's oftentimes done through a 99-year lease that's inheritable and renewable upon the turn of the properties. But the homeowner still owns the home and can make all the improvements, not only to the house itself, but to the land if they want to build a fence or put up a storage shed. All that is part of their ownership and equity as well. And the way we formally secure this is through a ground lease and a deed that are recorded on the land records at the time of closing or resale. So here's kind of a category or a breakdown of some of the similarities of a CLT homeownership and traditional. The homeowner still has a mortgage, still accumulates equity, again, at a different rate. The homeownership pays property taxes, can make alterations and improvements, and also receives tax deductions for mortgage interest and property taxes paid. Some of the differences are, again, purchase price is lower because of a subsidy or leverage dollars that are brought to the table at closing. The Community Land Trust has a small ground lease fee of $34 a month. This kind of ranges depending on where the Community Land Trust is throughout the nation. We currently have ours at $34 a month. That's one of the ways that we, as a Community Land Trust, continues to build some revenue source to sustain the work that we're going to be doing with preserving these homes into long-term permanent home ownership, but also some of the services that we provide as well too. And the homeowner cannot sell a home for full market value, must be sold to another income qualified family at an affordable price. Our community land trust sets that max at 80% of AMI, but again, we go down to 60% or 50% AMI depending on the different leverage products that we pull into our project. So that's a pretty key variation. So here's a example of how this works. So just assume that there's a family that wants to go out and buy an existing home on the market and they need to rehab that home a little bit. So you have somebody that's at 80% of area median income. If they look at the house, it's $230,000. It needs $60,000 of repairs. So the total development cost, essentially your closing cost, might be about $290,000. But the client can only get a mortgage for about $167,000. So there's a gap of $123,000 for that individual, that family, to buy that home. So what we do is we go out and get grants or partnerships from a number of different entities, including Minnesota Housing Impact Fund, which is typically awarded through the Super RFP. Many of you might be aware of that for multifamily. There's also a single family RFP that comes open in the summer and awards go out in December. That is basically a grant that's used for write-down assistance right up front. We oftentimes partner with a city and a county, talk about the local housing trust fund or the county or city state aid. This could be a source for that, could be other sources that the city might want to put into it. There's other down payment assistance programs that might be out there at the local level, at the county level, or state or federal level that oftentimes we can leverage, whether it's a first-time home buyer assistance. Sometimes counties just have a down payment assistance because they want more home ownership in a particular county, and there aren't a lot of barriers or regulations centered around those. And we might be able to go out and get some community donations and grants. So in that particular situation, we're able to fill that gap with $123,000. We bring that to the table at closing so that the client is still paying a mortgage on $167,000. So that's one quick example. I want to show you another example that we're currently working on in Mankato right now, where it's at 60% AMI. So the ability for the client to have a mortgage is a little bit lower at about $142,000 in this situation. New homes in the Mankato market, plus land and fees and all those things, are at about $370,000. We're actually seeing the same thing in Worthington, Minnesota, maybe a little bit less than this, but about $370,000 for total development costs for a new 3 or 4 bedroom home. In this situation, the gap is $227,000 approximately. In this situation, we again got funding from the state of Minnesota, the city and county aid and grants. The developers in the situation decided to write down the cost of the project as a donation to the project. There's down payment assistance and loans that are going to be coming available here this spring that a resident will be able to use as a first generation home buyer. More details to come on that in coming months. Keep a lookout for that, as Minnesota Housing will be unveiling that here in a couple of months. And then other community donations or grants that we're able to leverage. This is actually a real example where we're able to bring about $230,000 to the table to help write down that cost. That homeowner will continue to pay a mortgage at $142,000. So the last example I'm going to show you here is, well, what happens if you resell that house? So kind of looking at that, an example of a initial appraised value of a house is at about $246,000. The purchase price was maybe at about $172,000. There was a gap of $75,000 that other entities brought to the table. Fast forward maybe 10 years, and the current appraised value is about $287,000. The initial appraised value again is about $246,000. The market value appreciation over that 10 years is $40,000, but we put a restriction on that shared appreciation factor so the homeowner only gets 30% of that essentially equity. So they're still building equity. This does not include any principal paid on the home, which they're also building equity for. So that's in addition to this $12,000. So that shows the variation of like a resale in the future and how we're able to sustain the affordability of this home at about $184,000 versus what might be $287,000 in the market. So we essentially pay that forward. And one of the things we like to talk about a lot is when we go to a city and a county is that, yeah, it seems like a lot of money to put up $50,000 or $70,000 for one homeowner. But in reality, we're passing that on to multiple homeowners in the future through that resale. If that house is turning every 10 years, that's That's 10 homeowners and families over a 10-year period, which we don't have to go back to the city and county again for additional funding. It just essentially rolls forward. So it's a one-time investment now for the next 100 years. So here's kind of some comparisons of, and I won't go through a lot of detail here, but just kind of shows as kind of a selling point of, how home ownership relates to rental. If you're, at 60% AMI in the market, what the difference of that is if you compare that to a community land trust as well too. So kind of a three faction comparison here in terms of how you build equity, what resales are at, and essentially financial gain. So obviously this slide shows that the financial gain isn't going to be nearly as good as a traditional homeowner, but most families at 60% AMI cannot buy a home right now. So that's kind of the recognition. Again, some recap items of the land. Ground lease is 99 years renewable, small monthly lease fee of $34 a month. We have not had any problems with homeowners paying that. It's been very stable. And to provide a little bit more background on what we currently have for a land trust, so we've got 2 homes in Worthington. We've got 2 single-family homes in Wilmer, and we've also got a multifamily complex in Wilmer. And we're currently committed to building another 13, actually take that 14 homes in the Mankato and St. Peter area. So we're looking at building this community land trust more in the future. Just kind of want to back up and provide that point as I'm kind of in the middle of the presentation here. So we as a land trust have the first option to purchase that home if the homeowner wants to sell. So we'll go in and do our tour of the property, and might be a quick sale so that we can get that homeowner on to their next maybe purchase of home that they're willing to work with. We've been flexible on that, or we just allow, if everything's in good form, for the homeowner to go through that process on their own and sell the home. But we've got that first option. So there's always a little bit of that control there just in case something's happened with the home and needs some repairs or improvements. Again, there's a formula for the resale price guaranteed, which I've outlined here, but again, continues to provide fair equity to the homeowner and future affordability at the home as well too. There's a lot more detail here that I'm not going to go through that kind of goes through the actual ground lease regulations. Don will likely send out this presentation to all of you afterwards, and this is probably for some additional context of what people can and cannot do. For example, you can't sublease out your home. The homeowner is responsible for other things such as insurance and use by others. And we have the right to inspect the property except the interior, but we have to give 24-hour notice just in case something else is going on with the land itself. Other highlights here too, can transfer the home and ground lease to heirs. There are some limitations on that or some guidelines on that. And we also recommend upfront that all homeowners get a legal counsel involved regarding the ground lease as well too. And we've got a number of attorneys that are aware of what that ground lease means. And we haven't found a lot of pro bono attorneys to provide that service, but we have found some attorneys to provide that at a reduced cost. So just to make sure that the homeowner is comfortable with everything that's being transacted at the end of the day. So and here's kind of a traditional step if you have individuals that are looking forward to investing in a community land trust home, that they would like to attend one of our educational courses called Homestretch, meet with one of our homeownership counselors. We then get into a little bit more about what the actual partnership community land trust is and do an actual one-on-one training session. They complete an application, and they also receive a pre-approval letter from a lending institution for community land trust specific loan products. So we're out talking to banks about this, and some are a little bit leery about this, going through it for the very first time, but those that have gone through it see it as a great model for another alternative to home ownership for a lot of the clients that they serve. They would then enter into a purchase agreement for the home. The final mortgage application is processed as traditionally. And again, that independent legal review of the land trust ground lease, just to make sure that they fully acknowledge it and understand kind of that future equity, that future shared equity that we talked about. And then there's closing. So a few more additional steps in there, but it takes probably just a little bit longer than I would say a traditional conventional closing, but we are becoming more and more efficient with that as we continue to work with a lot of realtors and banks that are familiar with it. So it's been a great asset to us, and we've been really growing it. So And here's some other post-purchase services that we provide through the Community Land Trust as well too, as identified before for your takeaway. So with that, just kind of want to open things up for questions. A lot of details here is only one practical example of how you can use some of the other identified sources we talked about here today, but that was kind of the intent, is to kind of showcase a practical example to the group here today.
Great. Thanks, Chad. Again, questions for Chad about this different sort of tool? Chad, I have one for you, maybe about that. So you talked about different locations where you have this model in place. In working with the community, how does that normally come about? Does a community come and say, gosh, we have this property, you know, that it was maybe a subdivision was never built out, or it was maybe, you know, several property where there's infill opportunities, and where does somebody start with even identifying where to establish a community land trust in their community?
I think that's probably come from a variety of different ways, and I think one of the more prevailing you know, determinations or preferences right now, we hear a lot from employers that are having a challenging time retaining and recruiting workforce, and they would love to get their workforce into home ownership, but they might not be at the income range right now where they can afford a home, because they, as the employer, want them to be long-term assets and community members, so they don't get harvested away to other jobs in other communities or recruited away. So that's one way, and typically they're advocating to their local city council or county government on more traditional ways in which we have to get involved. I would say more recently in St. Peter and Mankato, there's been kind of a long history of both the city and the counties there being invested in affordable housing and looking at new models. In Mankato specifically, it was a goal that was established as part of their strategic planning, and we were a natural fit because we're right in their jurisdiction. So the dominoes kind of align there quite well. But as you can see, with some of the funding sources, it took some work to get a lot of partners on board, and it still does to this day. But they all recognize that they're all as part of this as a broader team. And it's not just their one source of funding coming to the table, but leveraging their funding to get other sources as well too. And I would say it's become more popular here in the last few years as I've been going to different national conferences and such. Community land trusts are really growing because there is this growing disparity between the cost of homes and homeowners in terms of their wages and such aren't keeping up as much as the cost of construction has. And with interest rates now, it's been a barrier as well too. We are oftentimes able to find some preferred loan or lending products as well too that can be coupled with these community land trust homes, particularly in the more rural areas of our region. So keep that in mind as well too. We'd like to try to help connect dots. And then I would say again, with the state of Minnesota's historic investment in $1 billion to housing in the last year, there's a lot more funding going out to the type of unique shared equity models. So we've been very intentional about ramping up this work as well too. So it's really kind of coming in a number of different forms.
Good, thank you. Other questions for Chad, or I'll open it up to any questions for any of our presenters today. I did see that Elizabeth in the chat, she put in several links to some of the tools that she mentioned in her presentation, some of the kind of the case studies and their kind of applications for technical assistance. So check out those. But other questions for the group? Everyone is pretty quiet, thinking about all of the information and the data for a Friday afternoon.
Yeah, I was going to say it's Friday afternoon, so
I know.
it might be a little.
Well, if
What
there's no other,
communities are represented on the call? I was just kind of curious.
good question. Let me just double check here and I'll look at the, we have, I mean, I'm just looking through the list. So we have Dawson, Appleton, Montevideo, Swift County, Lisa, I'm going to say you represent Big Stone County, Montevideo, Claris City, City of Madison. So a good diversity of communities from throughout the region.
That's great.
Yeah, as a comment, there's busy digesting all of the information from today. So
There's a lot.
yeah, there is.
Yeah, this is Robert Wolfington from the city of Montevideo. I just wanted to thank the presenters and appreciate the information. It is a lot of dense information and digesting everything and thinking about some land we have here in town and what we might be able to do with it.
Yeah. And I think that was our intent. Again, there's a lot of discussion. We heard about that historic investment from the state of Minnesota into housing dollars. I mean, these housing aid dollars that are going out to the counties and the competitive rounds for things coming up for cities and the, you know, the match opportunities. Again, there's a tremendous emphasis right now on trying to provide funding and tools for communities to address housing because, you know, people keep talking about it's such a critical issue and it's not just one slice of housing. Again, it's the spectrum, everything from, you know, really keeping affordable housing options in our community to, you know, market rate and workforce housing and everything else in between. So today was really intended to be a tool chest. And I will say we have recorded this presentation today. We will get everything collected, including the presentations from our lovely presenters. And we will make sure that we email all of the people who registered for today. I'll email you the link once we get that posted. So you'll have those resources. And I would encourage you that, again, if you have other key community members that may benefit from listening to this or looking in through those resources, that's why we wanted to record it and share that. So we want it to be recycled within our community. So if there's no other questions for the day, I'm happy to let you out 15 minutes early and on a Friday afternoon. So thank you to all of the presenters. I really appreciate your time and expertise today. And thank you for all of those that joined us online. Happy Friday. Have a great weekend.
Happy Friday. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone.